Hello and welcome to today's Manhattan Town Meeting of the LaRouche organization. Manhattan Project was founded by Lyndon LaRouche in 2014, and its purpose was to organize a literal nuclear explosion of American citizens to be engaged in their kind of rapid self-education using the classical works of Western civilization and the writings of Lyndon LaRouche in particular to resurrect the American presidency of Alexander Hamilton and George Washington. That was a very specific presidency, and it was a very specific idea. It was a federalist system which was born out of the successful military campaign of 1776 to 1783, which is what people generally call the American Revolution. But actually, it was the period between 1783 and 1789 that showed the greatest change, not only in America, but actually in the entire history of governments throughout the world. Because it was in that period that the American Revolution re-examined its own axioms. It recognized the flaws of the democratic confederacy that they had created, and they created a new form of government, heretofore unseen in the world. It was devoid of monarchy, of oligarchy, and aristocracy, but it also was not a democracy. It was a democratic republic whose forward economic progress was unique in all of human history because it was proceeding from the idea of internal improvements of the nation, meaning the building of canals like the Erie Canal, roads, foundries, and later railroads and other infrastructure. And this would use the credit of the people of the United States, the government of the United States, in the service of the people. Now, that presidential system and the independent role of the United States Treasury and government through the presidency and Congress to foster the technological progress of the nation was brutally attacked in the years following the death of President Franklin Roosevelt in April of 1945. That attack was continued and most brutally carried out in the form of the Kennedy assassination, also of November of 1963. In the late 1960s, one man realized what the nation had to do in that situation of crisis, and that man was Lyndon LaRouche. Next week marks the 50th anniversary of one of the more remarkable accomplishments of Lyndon LaRouche, and here to discuss that and what we will be doing next week is Dennis Small.
On August 15, 1971, 50 years ago, President Richard Nixon delivered a dramatic 18-minute national television address. It was a Sunday. He announced, number one, that the dollar was being taken off the gold standard. The dollar would no longer be redeemable in gold. Number two, that a floating exchange rate system would replace the existing fixed exchange rate international monetary system. And number three, that a temporary wage and price freeze would be instituted in the United States, which quickly became phases 1, 2, and 3 drastic austerity measures. Although Nixon announced these measures purportedly to rein in financial speculation against the dollar, they in fact opened the floodgates to the most massive, lengthy, speculative binge in the history of mankind, coupled with physical economic collapse, which continues to this day.
Good evening. Addressed the nation a number of times over the past 2 years on the problems of ending a war. Because of the progress we have made toward achieving that goal, this Sunday evening is an appropriate time for us to turn our attention to the challenges of peace. America today has the best opportunity in this century to achieve two of its greatest ideals, to bring about a full generation of peace and to create a new prosperity without war. This not only requires bold leadership ready to take bold action, it calls forth the greatness in a great people. Prosperity without war requires action on three fronts. We must create more and better jobs. We must stop the rise in the cost of living. Accordingly, I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States. In full cooperation with the International Monetary Fund and those who trade with us, we will press for the necessary reforms to set up an urgently needed new international monetary system. Stability and equal treatment is in everybody's best interest. I am determined that the American dollar must never again be a hostage in the hands of international speculators. The time has come for exchange rates to be set straight and for the major nations to compete as equals. There is no longer any need for the United States to compete with one hand tied behind her back.
Nixon's speech was followed by the Azores International Monetary Conference in 1972, which officially ended the fixed exchange rate system, and later by the 1999 cancellation of FDR's Glass-Steagall Act, which put the last nail in the coffin. Nixon's action unleashed an international speculative feeding frenzy that has today driven total speculative financial instruments, such as derivatives, up into the range of $2 quadrillion. That's a 2 followed by 15 zeros. To be sure, there have been other speculative bubbles throughout history, such as the Dutch tulip mania of 1634 to 1638, the Mississippi bubble, 1719 to 1720, and the South Sea bubble, 1720. But they were all smaller and shorter in duration than today's monstrosity. Nixon's announcement of August 15, 1971, was the most far-reaching and catastrophic economic policy decision of the 20th century, in terms of its consequences down to the present. One economist, and one economist alone, called it. He warned that it was coming. He explained what it meant within hours of its announcement. And he spent the next 5 decades warning that if those policies were continued, the world would head into a systemic breakdown crisis and the likelihood of fascist economic policies. All the while, he presented detailed programs to reverse the crisis, based on the idea of peace through development and on fostering the productive powers of labor of every person on the planet. That man was Lyndon LaRouche. LaRouche was reviled and unjustly imprisoned for 5 years for these efforts. His policies were not implemented in the transatlantic sector, and the planet today is paying the price for that folly, in the form of a hyperinflationary blowout, an uncontrolled and deadly pandemic, and the danger of thermonuclear war. As a result of the campaign to defame LaRouche and silence his ideas, although you have probably heard of LaRouche, odds are that you haven't actually read anything that he wrote or studied his writings seriously. But some people, leading scientists and political leaders in different parts of the world, did listen to LaRouche and did study his works, from the Russian scientific giant Boris Kuznetsov, to former Mexican President José Lopez Portillo, to former Italian economics minister Giulio Tremonti. The LaRouche Legacy Foundation is proud to announce that on Saturday, August 14th, 50 years after Nixon's fateful announcement, it will hold an international seminar featuring such leading thinkers. You will be able to hear from them directly about LaRouche's economic breakthroughs, about his unmatched record of forecasts, and about his programmatic proposals to develop every corner of the planet and the solar system. The seminar will help you understand why it is past time to exonerate LaRouche's ideas, both for reasons of simple justice and to be able to at last implement his policies. Where were you 50 years ago on August 15th, 1971? Where will you be 50 years from today? Although there are very few individuals alive on the planet today who will personally experience those two dates, 50 years ago and 50 years hence, it is nonetheless the proper standpoint from which every individual should locate his identity, just as LaRouche did. What caused Nixon's August 15, 1971 announcement? LaRouche warned, going back as far as his forecasts of 1959 and 60, that if the policies associated with prominent monetarist economist Arthur Burns continued deep into the 1960s, we must expect a series of crises in the existing monetary system during the second half of that decade. If those policies continued, LaRouche warned, despite the warning shots of the monetary crises, there would be a general collapse of the existing Bretton Woods system. The policies that were implemented, especially after the 1963 assassination of JFK, fueled the speculative bubble and the takedown of the industrial economy exactly as LaRouche had warned would happen. The policies of University of Chicago's Milton Friedman were implemented with a vengeance by the Nixon administration, under the advice of the likes of Arthur Burns, George Shultz, and Paul Volcker. Friedman had called explicitly for unpegging the dollar from gold, quote, set the dollar free by stopping pegging the dollar, close quote. And in the months leading up to August 15th, 1971, Arthur Burns, by then the head of the Federal Reserve Bank, was making frantic phone calls to Wall Street banks, promising that the Fed would provide as much money as needed as soon as they needed it. From dead zero, the rate of monetary supply growth jumped to 13%. It was the 1970s version of quantitative easing. While LaRouche was warning publicly that a blowout was imminent, all of the leading economic luminaries were busy guaranteeing the opposite. Said Arthur Burns in 1969, quote, financial crises which frequently disrupted economic life in earlier times no longer exacerbate our troubles, close quote. George Shultz, director of the Office of Management and Budget, stated on May 10th, 1971, quote, when Nixon came into office, others said the inflationary thrust could never be contained without a virtual takeover of a major economic activity or a major depression. It was, and without either, close quote. And then, of course, there was Paul Samuelson, the 1970 Nobel Prize winner whose textbook, Economics, was studied by hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of hapless university economics students. He guaranteed, quote, the modern fiscal system has great inherent automatic stabilizing properties. All through the day and night, whether or not the president is to be found in the White House, the fiscal system is helping to keep our economy stable. If a recession should get underway while Congress was out of session, powerful automatic forces would go instantly into action to counteract it without the need for any committee meetings or for exercise of any human intelligence, close quote. Perhaps the only thing we can agree with Samuelson on is that no human intelligence was in fact exercised. Lyndon LaRouche decided, as he saw the oncoming train wreck bearing down upon the United States, that it was time to demolish the academic reputations of these and other economists. He personally challenged what he called the quackademics to publicly debate him, to demonstrate that their policies, of the Keynesians and the Friedmanites alike, were leading the world towards a new fascism modeled on the concentration camp economics of Hitler's finance minister, Hjalmar Schacht. Perhaps the most famous of these was Lyndon LaRouche's debate with the country's leading Keynesian economist, Professor Abba Lerner, on December 2nd, 1971, before hundreds of students at Queens College in New York City, during which the very liberal Lerner finally blurted out, quote, "But if Germany had accepted Schacht's policies, Hitler would not have been necessary." Years later, Lerner's supposedly opposite number, Milton Friedman, also jumped to Schacht's defense in response to a question phoned in to a July 24th, 1978 Chicago radio show. Quote, "Dr. Schacht cannot be held responsible for the crimes of the Nazis. Hitler's arise from monetary instability, and Schacht was a genius at preventing monetary instability. Had his policies succeeded, Hitler would not have come to power." Close quote. Both were merely following in the footsteps of Lord John Maynard Keynes himself, who praised Schacht's handiwork in the introduction to the 1937 German edition of his famous General Theory. Quote, "For I must admit that much in the following book was written and illustrated in reference to the situation in Anglo-Saxon countries. Nevertheless, the theory of production as a whole, which is the object of this book, can be much better adapted to the conditions of a totalitarian state than the theory of production and distribution of wealth under circumstances of free competition and a large measure of laissez-faire." Close quote. What was Lyndon LaRouche's fundamental discovery in economics? LaRouche himself explained it as follows in 1993. Quote, "The central feature of my original contribution to the Leibniz science of physical economy is the provision of a method for addressing the causal relationship between, on the one side, individuals' contributions to axiomatically revolutionary advances in scientific and analogous forms of knowledge, and, on the other side, consequent increases in the potential population density of corresponding societies." Close quote. LaRouche developed a pedagogical graph to point students in the right direction. If a society's rates of growth of monetary and financial aggregates rise hyperbolically as the physical economy collapses, that system will sooner or later blow out. All schools of economics, other than the Leibniz School of Physical Economy, otherwise known as the American System of Economics, focus exclusively on the two upper curves, absurdly thinking that problems can be foreseen and solved by merely monetarist manipulations. LaRouche used this scientific approach to issue 9 economic forecasts between 1956 and 1994, each of which was uniquely accurate, where every other living economist failed miserably. Then, on July 25th, 2007, on the eve of the 2007-2008 crash, which others said would never happen, LaRouche told a stunned international webcast audience, quote, "The world monetary financial system is actually now currently in the process of disintegrating. There's nothing mysterious about this. I've talked about it for some time. It's been in progress. It's not abating. What's listed as stock values and market values in the financial markets internationally is bunk. These are purely fictitious beliefs. There's no truth to it. The fakery is enormous. There is no possibility of a non-collapse of the present financial system. None." Close quote. Within weeks, the interbank market froze completely, followed quickly by the Northern Rock and Bear Stearns blowouts, and then the Lehman Brothers collapse of September 2008. Throughout his life, LaRouche showed that the art of physical economy lies in fostering man's unique creativity to achieve nonlinear leaps in the productive powers of labor. He developed potential relative population density as the key metric, along with energy flux density, to track man's expanded power in the universe. In 1998, in the course of a presentation he made along with Helga Zepp LaRouche in Mexico City, former President Jose Lopez Portillo provided advice which guides the LaRouche Legacy Foundation's August 14, 2021 seminar. It is time for the world to listen to the wise words of Lyndon LaRouche.
Yo felicito a doña Helga por estas palabras.
I congratulate Doña Helga for these words,
Impresionaron especialmente
which impressed me especially because first,
me encerraron en el Apocalipsis.
they trapped me in the apocalypse, but then she showed me the staircase by which we can get to a promised land.
Muchas gracias, doña
Many
Helga.
thanks, Doña Helga.
Doña Helga,
Doña Helga,
y en esto
and here
quiero
I
felicitar
wish
a
to
su
congratulate
esposo,
her husband,
Lyndon
Lyndon
LaRouche.
LaRouche,
y ahora es necesario que la sabia palabra de Lyndon LaRouche se escuche en el mundo.
and it
y
is
ahora
now
es por la
necessary
voz
for the world to listen
de
to
su
the wise
señora
words
esposa,
of Lyndon
como hemos
LaRouche.
tenido el privilegio
Now
de
it is through the
escuchar.
voice of his wife as we have had the privilege of hearing.
Que es importante que nos ilustren respecto de lo que está pasando en el mundo,
How important that they enlighten us as to what is happening in the world, as to what will happen, and as to what can be corrected.
que es importante que alguien dedique su
How
tiempo,
important
su
that someone dedicates their time,
y su
their generosity,
entusiasmo
and their
a ese
enthusiasm to
propósito.
that endeavor.
De mi parte, yo cumplí un periodo de responsabilidad
For my part, I fulfilled a period of responsibility,
de alguna manera dramática de lo que le ocurre
and I can report in a
a las
somewhat dramatic way
economías
what
nacionales
happens to national economies in an international financial order such as that which has ordered our affairs since Bretton Woods.
The world is today faced with a synergy of plagues. We're not simply talking about diseases in the normal way that they're thought about. There are also intellectual plagues, dead, zombie-like ideas that infect and eat the mind of the living. For example, the plague called the climate change emergency, where flood control, water management, and nuclear power production are what are actually required. The plague of untreatable diseases that merely require sanitation, not to spread, and of deadly epidemics such as the coronavirus that become pandemic only because governments are too foolish or corrupt to cooperate with one another. And finally, the plague of war. Wars of conquest fought for the purpose of actually defeating the very powers that seek the conquest. We've seen that in Afghanistan. We've seen it many times now in the past years with respect to both the United States, NATO, and other nations. We seem to no longer understand the idea of what constitutes human progress or the common good for our people. And we therefore no longer know how to access the powers of the American presidency for the common good, the true powers instilled in the American presidency, which were the powers that Lyndon LaRouche sought to utilize. The United States presidency should not be degraded to the stature of a mere political office, or even worse, a rubber stamp for policies dictated by self-doomed financial forces whose culture of predation and looting, though it's practiced by human beings, is not itself human. Again, the United States presidency, as devised by the Constitution and as implemented by George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, established a standard for the self-government of nations by free citizens independent of oligarchies. This was a republican system, not a democracy. And there's a reason for that. In degenerate societies, it is often the case that the majority of citizens do not necessarily want freedom. They prefer the dictatorship of the mob to the rule of reason. However they may be induced to that result, we've seen an epidemic of these sorts of things, including in the world less than 100 years ago, whether we're talking about fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, Japan, Spain, and then you even had those same tendencies in the United States and many other nations. We see troubling signs of that same thing, again, all over the world. And that's why a republican system is always superior to a democracy. It allows the power of reason to triumph over the destructive force of mob thought and momentary popular opinion. In the past 20 years, and particularly after the events of September 11th, 2001, virtually every policy implemented by and through the presidency of the United States has been disastrous. Military policies have been lethally disastrous. Financial policies seeking to bail out hopelessly bankrupt money institutions have probably killed more people than the military policies. The refusal to adopt a comprehensive public health policy for the nation in the context of the present pandemic, and that now combined with the rise of untreatable fungal and bacterial infections requiring vigorous preemptive public sanitation, will at this point take the lives of at least 1 million Americans or more, most likely. And it will fail untold millions throughout the world that depend upon the United States, together with other nations, to build such a World Health Platform in time to stop the planet from losing tens of millions of people unnecessarily. We will change our axioms, our assumptions, and our practices now, or we will die. And it is for precisely this time of crisis that the American presidential system and the constitutional system of the American Republic were designed. However, there is a requirement. You have to have a presidency that has a vision of a future of progress for the nation and for the world. Franklin Delano Roosevelt's presidency was the last that really had that in American history. So what do we do now? Lyndon LaRouche, when he first announced his first run for the Democratic Party nomination for the presidency of the United States back in 1978, over 40 years ago, gave us an idea then of precisely what we have to do now.
And what are we going to do? We're going to build duplexes. Lay it out to us. How do you build a duplex? Well, you go out and you dig a big crater. You lay a big footing, unless you've got bedrock, which even that off. You don't even care what the terrain is like. Makes no difference. Wherever you are, blast it out, build a crater. Build a crater covering an area the size of a city of 500,000 people or 100,000 people. But build a crater for an industrial city of a new type on an area of that size. All right, 6, 7, 8 stories below the surface. Build it up. Build up to the surface. On this thing, stick 2 nuclear plants, 0.5 gigawatt to 2 gigawatts each. You get a balanced load. String industries around this, using this energy to cut low distribution costs, like charm bracelets. Well, let's put a chemical industry here, that's the good thing. Let's have desalination here, so forth. Using the waste heat and the electrical power. Build housing for the families, modern housing to last 100 years. For the families of the people who are going to be brought in to do the construction, which will be done, completed within a period of 4 to 6 years. Build the on-site cultural program, schools, universities, technical schools, everything that a city requires. And when the project is completed, at the end of 6 years, these people occupy the factories because they've been educated. And gradually the Europeans and others who have been phased in phase out, except for a few key technicians. The city then is built, it's modular, you can change it, you can develop it with no big cost. Its transportation systems are built in and modular for the next 100 years, for any technological improvements which will be significant in the next 100 years. The city functions, city buildings. Now, 4 to 6 years, we're going to build hundreds of these in the next 25 years. Hundreds of them. Hundreds of new cities throughout the world, especially in the developing sector. These cities will be linked together. They will form a network of high technology culture, planted in the middle of the rest of the population. And from these cities and through these cities and their universities and technical schools and technical services to the surrounding area, we'll lift one generation of the human race up from barbarism and oppression into modern life. And it would, in the next 25 years following that, we'll complete the job. And within 50 years from now, the human race will be transformed as we city builders intend to do it. We are going to mobilize every industry that exists, that's viable, and every one that can be created to do this. We're not going to export a few $10, $20 billion worth of additional exports. We're going to export hundreds of cities. We're going to change the world in 50 years entirely. And we're going to lay the foundation for changing the world in 25 years. Our export program is going to rise to the trillions. And there's nothing speculative about it. It's just a hard business deal. That's all. Put me in the White House. Get a bunch of these characters down. American corporate power, European corporations. Get them down there and I tell them what we want to do. And they say, what about the details? I said, don't bother me about that. I know how to build something. You guys do it. Make it work. And remember, it's going to be built in 4 to 6 years this way, and there's not going to be a delay. You're going to get the job done. Now we're going to go out and negotiate. You are committed to doing it. Now we're going to go out and negotiate. We're going to deliver. We're going to give these things.
So this was an idea not merely for a new economic policy or for a few jobs or even for new technologies being applied to an old system. It was an idea for an entirely new platform for human development, a completely different way of thinking, not about things, but about people, about new cities, new combinations of people. Of course, the city had been the center of progress for humanity throughout the entirety of humanity's existence. That is, until recently, until the recent ideas that came into focus, particularly during the 1960s. Lyndon LaRouche did not become president because he was advocating a radical program of growth entirely consistent with the outlook of Abraham Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt, but which ran counter to the zeitgeist of the 1960s and the 1970s. The zero growth, zero population growth ideology. It was being popularized all over Europe at the time initially through the Club of Rome, which was started in 1968, and then infected the United States as well in the form of Earth Day and in the form of the book Limits to Growth in 1972. But these forces really weren't from the 1960s. They were really from the 1860s and earlier, from the time of the Congress of Vienna of 1815, in fact. They were European forces that were particularly represented by the British Crown, but by the unity of forces involved at the Treaty of Vienna in 1815, which had opposed Abraham Lincoln and which actually successfully, ultimately, reclaimed the United States and control it in some respects to this day.
That great upsurge called European civilization, erupting out of the Golden Renaissance,
reaching a zenith in the American Revolution and the short-lived German liberation wars. That impulse, partly crushed by Henry Kissinger's ancestors at the Treaty of Vienna, Congress of Vienna, crushed by Capodistria Venice, by Nesselrode, who should have been turned into a pie earlier, by Castlereagh and by Metternich. This oligarchical conception of society, certified by the Treaty of Vienna, born out of the bowels of the whore of Babylon, literally, the Chaldean form of society, the form of society of that abomination, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, that abomination, the Ottoman Empire, that abomination, the Russian Empire, and sundry Oriental empires of similar description. That abomination, directed specifically against what were called the ideas of 1789, against the American Revolution, the idea of a democratic constitutional republic under law, governed by reason, which Henry Kissinger has avowed himself to destroy, and has done a good deal considering his limitations to do just that. In about the 1870s, that great upsurge, arrested but not defeated by the 1815 Treaty of Vienna, was unleashed in what can be called the first of a series of downward cultural paradigm shifts leading to our present condition of imminent disaster, a disaster comparable to but exceeding the disaster which struck Europe in the form of the so-called New Dark Age, from the death of Friedrich Hohenstaufen in 12 AD to the culmination of the peaking of the Black Death in Europe in 1351 AD. We are now, and have been for 100 years, in a period precisely comparable to that. Don't blame particular policies. The politicians don't know what their policies are. They just know they've been told to push them. The people who invent the policies, except on the very highest level among the Benedictines, don't even know how the policies are made and concocted. You have to go to Venice, to the island of St. George Major, or the Montserrat Abbey in Spain if you want to see devilishness in South America, to understand who makes the policies and how. Or if you can stand the smell, to Mount Athos in Greece, which is the master of this sort of thing. But for 100 years, civilization has been sliding toward hell in a paradigm shift, and the people who have been involved day to day in engineering the policies leading to that downslide, most cases don't even know. They just think they're doing what's right because their unconscious impulses tell them that's the right that's the way right people behave. What happened essentially in the 1870s was that the United States was destroyed as a sovereign republic. The United States in the 1860s, in the course of the Civil War, had emerged as the most powerful economy and greatest military force on this planet. This transformation had been accomplished not by the means of war, which are inherently destructive. They've been accomplished by the form of mobilization of our republic by Lincoln, who himself was a profound thinker, contrary to the school books of today, and who was guided by the principles of republicanism in the deepest and purest sense, who organized a mobilization of industry, agriculture, and institutions, and infrastructure building to transform this nation and its potentialities into the most powerful economy and military capability on the face of this planet. Within 10 years, that power had been destroyed, and the sovereignty of the United States, in the truest sense, had ceased to exist. The means by which this was accomplished, which had worldwide implications and made possible every other kind of deviltry which has plagued the world in any part since, was the enactment of the predecessor of the Graham-Rudman Bill, the U.S. Specie Resumption Act of the 1870s. The act was conceived by a Congress as corrupt, or not quite as corrupt, as the present Congress, a Congress bought and controlled by the British and Swiss, a Congress governed by treason, which set out, as the authors of Graham-Rudman did, to destroy the United States. And they should have been hung as traitors, and the world wouldn't be in the mess that it's in today.
Abraham Lincoln, as Lyndon LaRouche indicated, was a profound thinker. He believed in the idea of population growth. He believed in the idea of technological progress. And when he came in to the presidency of the United States, almost as soon as he walked in the door, began a program for what was called the Transcontinental Railroad. For the first time in history, what would happen is that a continent would be linked by a system of transportation, and that would revolutionize all the political economy that came after it. Now, Lyndon LaRouche did something which immortalized Lincoln's design, and he did it during the period 1989 through 1991 when he was incarcerated. It was called the Eurasian Land Bridge. So taking that earlier conception of what Lincoln did in America, which was a conception that many people in the world attempted to emulate, including the Russian Trans-Siberian Railway and other forms of cooperation that existed between the United States and Russia back at that time. LaRouche took the idea, and you see, as it says on your screen, it was sketched by the late Hal Cooper for Lyndon LaRouche. And the notion was to create what would be called by LaRouche development corridors. We'll be hearing a bit more about this in a few moments. In fact, what we want to say about this is that this was no longer a design for a railway system. This was now a design for something much different. The character of the idea that Lyndon LaRouche put forward was one for the entire world. And he addressed this at a conference of the Schiller Institute in 2002.
There are some practical considerations in this, strategic ones. And you'll see that the two focal points of this conference will turn out to be at the end as they are at the beginning. The issue of Eurasian recovery, Eurasian development as the pivot for world recovery, including the role of Russia as a very special part of any such recovery effort, and the relationship of this Eurasian commitment to the contrasting situation of Africa. In other words, to understand the world as a whole in the simplest terms of reference, look at the possibility of what we can do in Eurasia, and then look at the needs of Africa in order to see humanity in its wholeness. Those who have the means to lift themselves up, and those on whose behalf, in the larger term, they must act to lift them up too. Because the idea of the general welfare, while it's a notion of government of each nation, also must be a notion of the relationships among nations of the world. We must find a community of principle in the notion of the general welfare to unite nations for a common good. The common good is the general welfare of the nations, of the people in each, and of the community of nations as a group. It's the only chance for this planet. And in order to make this work, as has been understood for more than a century, and almost a century and a half now, the only way this could be worked was to develop a system of infrastructural development, which would effectively link the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean across Eurasia. Now, this is not railroads. This is not Silk Roads. These are corridors of development, corridors which run a range of, say, 100 kilometers in width, up to 100 kilometers, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, going in various directions, north, south, and so forth. Along these routes, as we did in the United States with the Transcontinental Railroad, that the area on either side of the transportation axis becomes immediately in and of itself a sustainable area of economic development. Then by that means you can branch out from the main corridors into subsidiary corridors of development and capture the area. If we make that kind of link, you have one interesting change occurs immediately. For as long as we know, mankind's economy has been dominated by the oceans. Contrary to all these theories that the British biblical archaeologists tell you, civilization did not come from inland and march down the rivers to the seas. It went the other way. Everything we know, especially the information on the internal characteristics of ancient astronomical calendars, shows that these astronomical calendars were predominantly the calendars used by a transoceanic maritime culture functioning a long period of time when most of North Eurasia was under a giant glacier for about 100,000 years. And during that period, most of what became later civilization was running around the oceans. And from the time that these maritime cultures came back into Eurasia, following the melting of the glacier about 20,000 years ago, when that began, was to move inland. And the first directions were to move along the great riverways inland, to move along the coastways, close to the seas and close to the maritime traffic. And if you look at the map of the world, you'll find the characteristic of development, or non-development, is the lack of the ability to utilize efficiently the inland areas, the landlocked areas of the world, with the same degree of efficiency and productivity we can use the coastal areas and the chief riverways. So therefore, if you look in Central Asia, what do you see? You see, here's the heart of it. In China, you have a coastal area of China which reflects this, which is more highly developed, relatively speaking, and inland, the area is poorly developed, the population has a poorer standard of living, poor opportunities for development. This extends then into Central and North Asia as a whole. Therefore, if we conquer this area, what happens? Take a transportation alone. People will think today, who don't think, will think that ocean freight is the cheapest way to move freight. It's not true. The cheapest way to move freight is across land, not by truck. Trucks running up and down the highway tell you that the economy is being mismanaged. Too many trucks. It's not efficient. Costs too much. Intrinsically bad. Railways are much better. Integrated transport systems featuring railways, especially magnetic levitation systems, are excellent. Magnetic levitation systems move passengers more rapidly, but magnetic levitation systems for moving cargo, for freight, that is really a wonder. That's where the payoff comes. If you can move freight from Rotterdam to Tokyo at an average rate of 300 kilometers per hour without much stopping along the way, and if for every 100 kilometers of motion across that route you are generating the creation of wealth through production as a result of the existence of that corridor, then the cost of moving freight from Rotterdam to Tokyo is less than zero and can be up to 200 to 300 kilometers per hour. Now, what ocean freight system can do that? did you ever see a large supercargo ship producing wealth while it was traveling across the ocean? And at what speed? So therefore, we've come to a turning point in technology, which we've emerged over recent periods, where the development of the internal landmass of the world and the great typical frontier is Central and North Asia. It's the greatest opportunity, single opportunity, before all mankind for development. Now this requires some revolutionary changes in the way we think about things. This means that we would be engaged in the greatest change in the environment in the history of mankind. This single project, say a 25-year or more, development of Central and North Asia in this direction, including the conquest of the tundra. The Arctic tundra is one of the great frontiers to be mastered. It can be done. Would mean a great change in the environment. Now, how are we going to decide what is good and bad about changing the environment? Well, what people think today about the environment is pretty stupid. It's wrong. It doesn't make any sense. They don't know what they're talking about. And you see the kind of education you get, no wonder they believe that nonsense. Especially people with physics degrees who don't know which end is up. But the great theory of the environment was established by a Russian of Ukrainian credentials, Vladimir Vernadsky, with his concept of geobiochemistry. See, what you're taught, the problem here is you're taught in most universities and elsewhere about science is nonsense. It's a damn lie, most of it, to put it frankly. What you're taught as basic physics is mostly a lie. Because we know from, as Vernadsky demonstrated this in his own way, and others have known it and shown it, that there are actually three principles involved in man's physical relationship to the earth and the universe. Three categories. One, the category we call non-living processes. What most people who aren't well educated call physical processes. Yeah? The second one, which some people don't understand, those in molecular biology, they refuse to understand it. Yeah? It's called the principle of life. You will never get life out of a non-living process. Life is, as Pasteur insisted, is a principle unto itself. But how it's a universal physical principle, which, as Vernadsky demonstrated with his biogeochemistry, is that the history of Earth is what? The oceans and the atmosphere were produced by living processes. Down several kilometers in the Earth's surface, most of the Earth that we're in touch with as humanity was created as a byproduct of living processes. What Vernadsky calls the natural products of the biosphere. We can measure it. We can measure the power of the biosphere over the non-living process. We can measure it. Living processes are superior to non-living processes. They're more powerful. They're apparently weak, but their long-term effects are more powerful than the short-term effects of the non-living processes. Now there's a third thing, which again Kant won't let you know. Immanuel Kant. That's why they call him Kant, because he can't do anything. If you believe him, you can't do anything either. The essential nature of man is that we are capable of making discoveries of universal physical principle. Discoveries we can validate in known experimental ways. By applying these principles, we increase our power in the universe in ways that can be measured physically per capita and per square kilometer. We can measure this in terms of the demographic effect of this kind of action. That is, does the human species improve its life expectancy, its power to exist in the universe as a result of this? Yes, it does. That's good. Mankind actually is primary mastery of nature has occurred in terms of man's mastery and development of the biosphere. So actually, the biosphere is including what we call basic economic infrastructure, such as waterways, power systems, transportation systems. These are part, the development of cities, of good cities at least. These are natural products of cognition which are reflected as improvements in the biosphere. The biosphere is weak. It is stupid. It does not know how to deal with the deserts it has. It does not know how to deal with the tundras. It does not know how to deal with other problems that it has. But we as human beings can come to our poor, stupid slave, the biosphere, and say, we will educate you and we will make you stronger and better. So mankind intervenes in the biosphere to make the biosphere better. And so the principles of discovery, the application, the discovery of principles applied to the environment creates the natural products of cognition in the biosphere, which improves the biosphere, which increases the product, the potential for human life. So this is not a mysterious, arbitrary area. This is an area of science. It's an area of scientific precision, which would mean that the job to do is not to say, is it good or bad to tamper with the environment? It's very good to tamper with the environment if you know what you're doing. But you have to develop the science of water management, the science of transportation, the science of reforestation, the science of how to change and control the atmosphere and the climate. You can't make big mistakes. These mistakes will live with you for a quarter century or longer. You can't make big mistakes. Therefore, you have to have competent people, competent groups of people making the determination of how we do this. But by changing the biosphere of Central and North Asia and changing the biosphere in the arid areas of China and so forth, we will create the greatest boon for humanity in any part of this planet. What we need is a task-oriented mission task force to undertake the policy planning for precisely this, and it must be international.
The outlook of the American presidency, in short, was that of the city builder, not of the Malthusian. The concept was from the time of Washington and Hamilton's 4 reports on the subject of manufactures, of the National Bank, the public credit, on the constitutionality of the bank, was to create nations, in this case, in particular the United States, which would be able to grow and develop. And this would be not only good for humanity as a whole, not only for the biosphere as a whole, but for the universe as a whole. It was actually the purpose of human existence. This, of course, is much in contention, especially in today's peculiar world of paganism in the United States, in which the view is that mankind is a pollutant, not merely carbon dioxide, but people. And the recent remarks of the International Panel on Climate Change and some others, in which they now begin to admit that their real target is depopulation, underscores precisely this difference. It was not only Abraham Lincoln, and it wasn't only the cause for which he fought, that showed this Malthusian, this anti-Malthusian outlook. One of Lincoln's colleagues and allies in the Congress of the United States, William Kelly, gave a speech after the war in New Orleans in 1867, in which this outlook is boldly stated. He said, "New Orleans is the entry point for the commerce of the Gulf, the trade of which proceeds under our bright flag. The river that winds around you, the Mississippi River, carries to the sea the waters of 60,000 miles of river course. The valley it drains will sustain a population of 500 millions of people. They will be free, intelligent, enterprising, and given to commerce. And your city will be the center of their great commercial exchange. But as I look through the vista of a bright future, the glories of the great cities of antiquity fade away. And Florence, Venice and Genoa recur to me as so many distant villages. Not Paris or London will be your equal, for behind each of them lies a territory less in extent and resources than any one of a score of American states, while behind New Orleans lies the resources, agricultural, mineral, and manufacturing, of a territory broader and richer than all Europe, and a people destined at no distant day to be more numerous than the people of Europe. And when those days shall come, loyal men of Louisiana, the name of Abraham Lincoln will be uttered with reverence by every lip, and all men will give thanks to God that he so ordered his providence as to establish political equality throughout the enduring union of American states. I'd like to just point out that that speech was given in front of a crowd of Black and white veterans of the war and general citizens of New Orleans at that time. And of course, as was said there, William Kelly expected the Mississippi River Basin, meaning all the way up through Minnesota, down through Louisiana, to have 500 million people. Abraham Lincoln, famously in his 1862 State of the Union address, talked about the United States having 251 million people by the year 1930, and argued that the rate of growth of the United States from 1790 until 1860 just made it the case, if you simply extrapolated that rate of growth, that rate of population growth ought to occur in the United States. And he talked about the fact that there's no reason that that should not occur. It, by the way, was approximately half of what he stated by that time. What happened in America in that time is itself an interesting topic for another time. But talking here about the issue of Lyndon LaRouche and the idea of the American presidency and the idea of Lincoln's presidency and Hamilton and Washington's presidency and Roosevelt's presidency even, the idea was that human beings were good, that people came first, and that the more people you had, the more wealth you had. This, however, is not the outlook that was foisted upon the United States, largely through British intelligence, after 1945. As a matter of fact, the primary reason that Lyndon LaRouche himself got involved in what became a career in politics was to refute the ideas of entropy, of the winding down, of heat death, of not only negative growth, but the inevitability of death in the universe of life, of all life under certain circumstances. That outlook is the one that Lyndon LaRouche posed. The person that he chose as the primary opponent, which he spent his life refuting through his discoveries in economics, was a man by the name of Norbert Wiener, a mathematician who had written a book which LaRouche read and opposed violently, The Human Use of Human Beings. And he said in that book, there are local and temporary islands of decreasing entropy in a world in which the entropy as a whole tends to increase. And the existence of these islands enables some of us to assert the existence of progress. We ourselves constitute such an island of decreasing entropy. It may well be that life is a rare phenomenon in the universe, confined perhaps to the solar system or even to the Earth alone. It is quite conceivable that life belongs to a limited stretch of time, and that the time may well come when the Earth is again a lifeless, burnt out, or frozen planet. It is a foregone conclusion that the lucky accident which permits the continuation of life in any form on this earth, even without restricting life to something like human life, is bound to come to a complete and disastrous end. In a very real sense, we are shipwrecked passengers on a doomed planet. We shall go down, but let it be in a manner to which we may look forward as worthy of our dignity. Now, this outlook was completely antithetical to what Lyndon LaRouche talked about. And we want to just take a moment and talk a little bit about this concept of the development corridor, which he's already thoroughly described, to show you simply one of the examples or graphic design that we did for this. back in 1997 when Helga Sepp LaRouche took Lyndon LaRouche's idea about the Eurasian land bridge, ultimately the world land bridge, to China and to many other nations, nations which in fact adopted that outlook, though they adapted it as they wished, as China did, as other nations have begun to do. So you see here on your screen, the large circle, you see a river or running through the middle, the blue line, the middle large blue line. And you see these green areas within these pods. These are what are called urban nuclear-based industrial complexes. Each one of the circles represents a city, the blue circles. And the idea is that on either side of the main trunk line there, which is, as they say, either a rail line, it could be a superhighway, it could be a magnetically levitated train like they have in China, which we should have in America, or it could be all three. But the concept is that along this route of development, what we are looking for is not merely transportation, but the idea that the cities that you're seeing that are going to exist, and these are now the smaller towns, which are shown outside of the nuplexes. Yes, these are the towns, and then you see the industrial complexes are the larger green areas. So the towns on either side and the development on either side of these complexes means that the railway system or the magnetically levitated train system is not merely hauling freight through an area, but in fact, you can begin with a semi-finished product on one end, let's say in New York, and you can end at the other end with a fully completed product. Sort of think about it as though the development corridor is an assembly line. And that what happens is that people are able to contribute through parts assembly, secondary industries, machine industries, and so on, so that the movement of goods along this corridor is itself productive. So, as Lyndon LaRouche has said, if you have a ship that's going along the ocean, can the things on the ship become more productive? Can they become more specialized? Can you build things from semi-finished products to finished goods? No. But along a development corridor and running through the interior of continents, this completely revolutionizes human life, human productivity, and the possibilities for human creativity. So what we are going to be doing next week is not merely commemorating or memorializing, in one sense, Lyndon LaRouche's 1971, August 15th forecast, but rather we're going to be trying to visit for Americans the 50 years of degradation that we have lived through, the 50 years of humiliation by adopting the crazy idea of zero growth, zero population growth, zero industrial growth, negative growth, cutting back on energy, etc. These were the means by which the American Revolution itself, the American Republic itself, was being undermined, such that 5 years from the 250th anniversary of the founding of this country, America itself may be at issue, its continued existence. What we want to do is we want to bring you into a working arrangement, which we've called the coincidence of opposites, or the Committee for the Coincidence of Opposites in particular. So far, that committee has largely consisted of military persons, doctors, and other specialists who have been addressing the issue of the coronavirus. But of course, that issue goes way beyond vaccines. It has to do with public sanitation. It has to do with clean water. It has to do with very abundant uses of energy. It has to do with deploying these things into every corner of the earth as fast as possible, because in this case, the weakest person, the person who is most deprived, is the primary focus of any effort that can be successful in saving the rest of the human race. That is to say that the combination of non-treatable diseases and pandemic conditions, including the conditions of famine and of economic destruction that now exist on the planet, are an immediate threat to you, no matter how so-called rich you think you are. But it's only the American presidency, and not meaning only America. Let me be very clear, because the nation of China and the presidency of Russia in particular have been instrumental in keeping the human race alive and functional. While we may have differences, and with political differences of various types with different nations, the issue of our continued durable human survival requires a cooperation among all nations to the end of being able to extend the population, the life expectancy, of course, but also the possibilities of living in a productive, safe, healthy way to everybody on the planet. The adolescence of humanity has to end. We have to actually decide to converge on civilization. And civilization requires that we know how to navigate, not merely the Earth, but know how to navigate this region of the universe in which we find ourselves, the solar system in particular. That's what the ideas of science and technology are. That's what Lyndon LaRouche talked about, by the way, at the conclusion of his book, There Are No Limits to Growth, building the forests and cities of Mars. And that's what, in fact, the space programs of the United States, China, Russia, many other nations are all aimed at. In a few days, we will have a rendezvous, or a near rendezvous, of two spacecraft at the planet Venus. The Solar Orbiter, which is a European Space Agency and NASA project, and the Bepi Colombo project, which is of Japan and the European Space Agency. And each of these has a different mission. One is to Mercury, and one is to exploring the poles of the sun. This represents not merely the frontiers of physical economy of the human race, but the bedrock, the fundamentals of human economy. The United States, of course, had been the world's leader in this area, as it had been in many others. But it lost this leadership because it lost the ability to understand how to maintain it by developing the American presidency, meaning the presidential system, the one that includes you and me, the one that says that every citizen has access to changing the policies of the United States as a single individual, if he or she is able to affect the presidency to that end, as well as, of course, the Congress and other institutions. That's what Martin Luther King did with the question of civil rights vis-a-vis the Kennedy presidency. That's what Lyndon LaRouche did vis-a-vis the Strategic Defense Initiative with respect to the Reagan presidency. And it's that ability to make that kind of change in policy by having a vision of the future that requires that change in policy. That's what we as American citizens must now embark upon. We, I think, are all aware of the painful crises that we see, political, economic, and of course, even biological. The partisanship that people have engaged in is not only foolish, it's lethal. Does not mean that therefore you're supposed to drop your opposition. It means you're supposed to get smarter. And the idea of forcing a change in the mindset, in the axioms, in the way in which people continually make mistakes and claim that they're right, that was the true legacy of Lyndon LaRouche. And it is the legacy that has to become part of the considerations around the American presidency of this time. I'm not speaking merely about the idea of the Biden administration. I'm talking about the fact that we today find ourselves in a circumstance similar to the founders, similar to Lincoln, similar to Roosevelt, in which something must be done that changes everything. In order to understand best how to do that, we invite you to listen to the wise words of Lyndon LaRouche. Join us next week. You can go to the Schiller Institute site, for example, to find out more about the particulars of the event of next week. You can register for that now, but it'll be starting at 9 a.m. Next Saturday, and we hope to see you all there.
And what are we going to do? We're going to build new places. Lay it out to us. How do you build a new place? When you go out and you dig a big crater. You lay a big footing, unless you've got bedrock, which even that off. You don't even care what the terrain is like. Makes no difference. Wherever you are, blast it out, build a crater. Build a crater covering an area the size of a city of 500,000 people or 100,000 people. But build a crater for an industrial city of a new type on an area of that size. All right, 6, 7, 8 stories below the surface. Build it up. Build up to the surface. On this thing, stick 2 nuclear plants, 0.5 gigawatt to 2 gigawatts each. You get a balanced load. String industries around this, using this energy to cut low distribution costs, like charm bracelets. Oh, let's put a chemical industry here, that's the good thing. Let's have desalination here, so forth. Using the waste heat and the electrical power. Build housing for the families, modern housing to last 100 years. For the families of the people who are going to be brought in to do the construction, which will be done, completed within a period of 4 to 6 years. Build the on-site cultural program, schools, universities, technical schools, everything that a city requires. And when the project is completed, at the end of 6 years, these people occupy the factories because they've been educated. And gradually the Europeans and others who have been phased in phase out, except for a few key technicians. The city then is built, it's modular, you can change it, you can develop it with no big cost. Its transportation systems are built in and modular for the next 100 years for any technological improvements which will be significant in the next 100 years. The city functions. City buildings. Now, 4 to 6 years. We're going to build hundreds of these in the next 25 years. Hundreds of them. Hundreds of new cities throughout the world, especially in the developing sector. These cities will be linked together. They will form a network of high technology culture, planted in the middle of the rest of the population. And from these cities and through these cities and their universities and technical schools and technical services to the surrounding area, we'll lift one generation of the human race up from barbarism and oppression into modern life. And in the next 25 years following that, we'll complete the job. And within